Well, thank you first of all for a wonderful introduction, and thank you all for making it tonight. I am really thrilled to say this is my first public talk in Guyana, and indeed my first time here, and I'm just incredibly excited to be able to share my thoughts with you and my questions, which are open questions, which are many, and I'm sure you will be able to answer some. As mentioned, my research does stem from having been located for quite a long time in the UK, even though it is not my native country. And to a large extent, it deals with the way in which representation of landscape and nature have historically in Britain been very closely intertwined with forms of nationalism and patriotism, and how that has resulted in certain artists getting more exposure than other because they have been seen historically to better represent what it means to be British, even at moments when the very definition of this idea was absolutely in transformation or in crisis, depending on how you see it, what point of view you're coming at it with. So, as mentioned, my research deals specifically with representations of nature, land, and belonging in relation to politics of identity in the UK. The more I've been looking at artists like Aubrey Williams, the more it's clear to me that it just to have this national framework, it's a very limited approach, because this is an artist of cosmic import who moved throughout his life, who existed through different conceptions of nationhood and attachment to geography and place, moving between Guyana, London, eventually Jamaica, Florida, so very much a diasporic artist. So this immediately puts a lot of strain on the very framework of my project, but I still think it's very important for me to keep going with the framework I started with, because in the UK we are living through this moment of extreme backlash against the so-called multicultural society, a moment of revived xenophobia. Not that it ever went away, but it certainly is emboldened. And it's also a moment recently when art institutions are waking up or gesturing towards a more inclusive curatorial practice. So recently, the Tate, which is Tate Britain, the major national collection in the UK, which refused the opportunity to buy paintings by the Guyana-born artist Aubrey Williams in the 60s, recently has acquired all of his archive and they are now planning a very big exhibition on what they are calling the British Caribbean Diaspora, which will open in 2021, and for which I'm somewhat implicated. I'm writing an essay for the catalogue. But all of these events, as well as a big retrospective exhibition for another artist born in New Amsterdam, who moved to the UK in the 50s, Frank Bowling, which was an incredibly successful show in London. These are all events that are pointing to a moment in which art institutions, they are wanting to take a stance on this issue of what it means to be British, and where there have been failures in the last 60 years to recognize particularly artists from the Caribbean diaspora as British. And at the same time, there are many shortcomings still to how these institutions work, and how they're trying to repair the failures of the past. So it's still this question, the framework that I'm coming at Aubrey Williams's work with is still, I think, cogent, But of course, now that I've moved over here, part of the reason for being in Georgetown in the first place is to sort of shift my own worldview and perspective and not only get a sense of the landscape and the conversation here and the histories here beyond what I could have read in books, obviously, and heard secondhand, but it's also about shifting my own sense of really how to look at Europe, how to look at the UK, how to look at the world from another point in space and time, let's say. So this is all to say that my thinking is still somewhat fluid, and I really value the opportunity. So there will be questions that I'm opening up to myself throughout the talk, and I really value your input. And I'm also pitching this talk to different levels because I wasn't sure of who would be attending. And I know that some of you today in the audience know so much more about Aubrey Williams than I do, because you knew him personally, because you have many stories and anecdotes, and his work as an artist has been part of your visual field for a long time, way longer than mine. And so I do apologize to those of you who will find the material perhaps not original enough, but at the same time I really wanted to involve and get everyone to the same level, everyone in the room. So if there are some of you who maybe don't know very much, this will be an opportunity to be introduced to Aubrey Williams. And by way of a very brief background, Aubrey Williams was born in Georgetown in the late 20s from a fairly middle-class family, and very early on demonstrated a peculiar, remarkable aptness for drawing and art making, somewhat spontaneously, or so goes the story, and was able from an early age to receive some level of sporadic tuition or feedback from Edward Burroughs, who formed the working people's art class eventually, which is often presented as sort of the first formal art school in modern Guyana. He did not pursue an artistic career straight away. My understanding is that at the time it would have been quite difficult for a young man in Georgetown to imagine themselves as a full-time artist. The notion of that as a career was not necessarily available. And so Aubrey Williams trained, entered the civil service, and eventually ended up working as an agricultural officer in some of the sugar plantations around Georgetown. And this is an important backdrop because it says something about how his politics were formed, not necessarily in terms of party politics, but his sentiments towards notions of equality and justice, but also how his appreciation of the natural landscape perhaps started or was rooted, or at least formed through his own training as someone who worked closely with agricultural laborers, and so was already thinking from an early age about the relationship between consumption and production and where ecology and ecosystems sit within that. And that's particularly important to me because one of the reasons why, I'm drawn to Aubrey Williams' work because it looks incredible visually, and we'll get to that. It won't be black and white slides or empty slides for the rest of the presentation, but also because he had such an incredibly deep and visionary understanding of ecological matters and of the imbrication of the natural world and the human world in a way that very few artists, certainly in Britain in the 50s, had. And that's why, for me, it is especially distressful in a way that he has not received the recognition that he is owed, even though this is not to say that Aubrey Williams has not received recognition, and we'll get to that. He's a highly valued artist for anyone who works in the field of 20th century modern art. It's just that there could be more. As an agricultural field officer, to make a long story short, he ended up liaising and supporting more than he should have, according to the sugar barons that indirectly employed him, the independent growers who had created, as I understand it, plantations of their own, outside but contiguous with the British-owned Booker plantation. And so taking increasingly the side of the workers, helping them to organize at a moment of political turmoil, and I'm sure at a moment of destabilization that was slowly leading up to the movement for independence. He ended up finding himself in a delicate position and being removed from his placement near Georgetown and being shipped off to Hosororo, near the border with Venezuela, which at the time he experienced as akin to a death penalty or a death sentence. And so he packed his bag, went off on this new assignment, gloomily, which however then, because it was in Hosororo that he met and forged a relationship with members of Warao communities, to the point where he later would recount in London, to his London circles, to circles of London artists as well as I'm sure here, that he was, perhaps the right word is initiated, I'm not sure, but he was made a blood brother through a ritual. So there was certainly a strong kinship and affinity, although other artists we were talking earlier on, like Stanley Greaves, also Guyanese born, had sometimes the feeling that this connection was exaggerated in a sort of performative way, perhaps overplayed slightly. But nonetheless, Aubrey Williams certainly thought up of himself up to that point as an amateur artist, someone who mostly drew from life. And he did keep drawing for the rest of his life. There are sketches from every phase of his production, but the relationship with the Waraos and observing their practices led him to think about artistic form and its relationship to philosophy, metaphysics, the cosmos, life in the broadest possible sense, in a completely new way. And it was particularly as I understand it, and I wish there was a little bit more documentation on this, or that it's something that I feel like I have to look more into. What he was particularly compelled with was the Warao's use of color and the way in which they saw relationships between different entities and species in terms of abstract relations. And so that pushed him, as I interpret it, to move away from a more naturalistic way of copying from life and moving towards a way of understanding art as capturing the spirit of reality, and in this sense a step towards a more abstract way of imagining the process of picture making and representation. Perhaps this was not all happening in the immediate moment, but certainly as his career evolved and Aubrey Williams became known for his trademark abstract paintings, of which I believe we have one in the room, and there are two in display at Castellani House, which I was lucky enough to see today, and I really highly recommend that you go and see them. So as he came to be known as an abstractionist, certainly this narrative and this moment, this almost primal scene of this encounter with the Bauhaus took on a really legendary status in his own personal mythology and in the way he told the story of his development as an artist. And that's why I dwell upon it, even though we're really only at the very beginnings of his career. So as I said, at this point, Aubrey Williams is not a full-time artist. He spends 2 years at Hosororo, following which, due to a mixture of political tensions, political reasons, and his own desire to further his development by moving across the Atlantic, he leaves and relocates to London in the early 50s. Again, when Aubrey Williams arrives in London from Georgetown, he initially arrives with the intention of pursuing his studies as an agricultural scientist further, and very quickly realizes that the opportunity is now available to him to be an artist, full stop. And I think he also realized that the course he had enrolled on in a famed British university was actually, what they were offering was way behind what he had already learned on the ground in Guyana, so he wasn't all that interested in pursuing it further. So he becomes a painter full-time, and the next that I know, he is making these fairly large already, beautifully dense abstract paintings that are characterized by these shapes that many of you may recognize as allusions to the Guyanese petroglyphs, or rather the Amerindian petroglyphs that he had known of or observed in his homeland. And his success is actually quite astonishing early on. So he has a one-man show, a solo show, early on in a prominent avant-garde gallery called the Archer Gallery. And this is only a couple of years after he's arrived in London, and the show is a sellout. So it was, I think, quite mind-blowing for him to experience this early and definitive success. He sold everything, and so the path was open for him, and he became involved with a really interesting gallery called the New Vision Center Gallery, 1958 or 1959. He had 3 shows almost in a row in this gallery, and it was amazing for me to look at the archives of this gallery, because this gallery was very special, and it's difficult to retrace this now because there isn't so much evidence in their archives, and their archives are full of typed notes and there aren't many images, so they're not super fun to plow through as a researcher. But it was exceptional because it was run by 3 different painters, one from Poland, one from Wales, one from South Africa, who combined these nationalities that brought together Europe, the sort of divisions within the United Kingdom, so Wales being starkly different from England, and then the Commonwealth and South Africa, and these different geopolitical realities that were all in some way deeply connected to London and England and Britishness, but also very much apart and in tension with it. And so what this gallery did that was special was that it championed an incredibly cosmopolitan array of artists, and this was quite rare at the time in London, in the sense that the artists that really did well, that really got shown a lot over and over again, were overwhelmingly English artists, Francis Bacon, the most famous from this period, and otherwise European, Italian, French, and at a stretch, slightly later, American, New York based. So this gallery was bringing in artists from as far apart as Russia, and Venezuela, all over the Commonwealth, and most importantly, all of these artists were showing abstract art. And this was another sign of a certain kind of un-Englishness going on with this gallery, or certainly a kind of productive tension with the context of London and England in which the gallery was situated. There is a sense that the British post-war art world is somewhat unexciting. This is this sort of cliche, if you're an art historian, because the artists were not doing stuff that was as daring formally as what was happening in other countries like the US or France. They were not experimenting, and that was partly because the market really favored a kind of traditional mode of painting, particularly landscape painting, that has since been interpreted as providing almost a sense of security and continuity at a moment when, of course, Britain was losing its status in the world and its empire was beginning, well, it had begun for a while to crack at the seams. And so many historians have looked at these connections between a desire to stay with this pastoral style of painting that presented very inoffensive, stylistically as well as in terms of content, very inoffensive, bucolic scenes, and quite boring. And there are many catalogues of now forgotten artists. If you look at the institutions that really had the money and represented the nation and who were really sponsoring and helping artists survive, so the Tate, the Art Council, the British Council, these institutions were really championing a whole load of really boring landscape painters. It is quite remarkable if you look in the archives. And then you have artists like Aubrey Williams who are active at the same time, making these extraordinarily fiery paintings. And so this tells us that even as specialists of British post-war art, we have received a very skewed picture of what was going on in the 50s, partly because the funding bodies were not necessarily sponsoring the most exciting artists, and that had a lot to do with nationality as well. So the Vision Centre Gallery was so extraordinarily progressive because it was all about abstraction, which was what English critics of the sort of conservative kind feared the most. Abstraction, the classic comment was like, even a child can do it. What's all that about? What is it doing? This is not English. This is not our heritage. It looks a little French. We don't like it. That kind of thing. And I'm not, I'm caricaturing, but if you read the archives, they are full of these caricatures and stereotypes. That was the language of the time. This is an example of the kind of works that Aubrey Williams was making around this time. And my descriptions can only go so far in terms of doing justice to the color and the textures of these canvases, because they reproduce well enough because they are such bursts of pigment, but really you do need to see them firsthand because the painting is laid on thick. There are real accretions on the surface of the canvas, and some of the colors have a real brilliance. We were looking today at Castellani House, a canvas that I've been hoping to see for a long time, titled El Dorado, and we saw that the canvas has all these specks of gold paint in it, and it's just so such a satisfying, pleasurable experience from the point of view of just engaging with color and the pleasure of paint, which you could tell that this is a painter that, even though he's mostly dealing with quite difficult themes to do with displacement, diaspora, colonization, colonialism, he's also enjoying or that's how I imagine, maybe some of you will tell me otherwise, but I imagine him enjoying this relationship with color, with paint, and with the possibilities of this language, which is just so different from literature, so different from figurative painting, from landscape. It's just a world of relationships that exist on their own plane and can really go badly sometimes and sort of fail to give anything to the audience, but when done well, in a way in which I think Aubrey Williams does, it can have this real metaphysical potency and this sense of a real sort of cosmic poetry. And we'll have the colours have particular connotations around this time. Aubrey Williams' colours are to some extent subdued compared to how they will become later on. They're quite earthy, and often combined with the titles have these associations with landscape, particularly aspects of the Guyanese landscape. And here, I'm only at the beginning of my exploration, but these dark greens and sometimes red earths have a lot of analogies with the local landscape, from what I can surmise. And so it feels almost like he's dealing with this tradition of landscape that is so deeply tied up with power, with the process of in inverted commas, discovering land, of owning it, of colonizing it, particularly as landscape painting, it is often said that it reached its kind of climax in the British 17th and 18th century tradition, to the point where historians like J.W.T. Mitchell have stated landscape is the dream work of empire. Landscape painting and colonization go together. They're so deeply interconnected because the practice of acquiring land and displacing people often went hand in hand with having a sketch artist or a painter recreating the landscape for the colonizers and their publics at home, and sort of producing this sort of market of pictures. So it almost feels to me like Aubrey Williams is, on the one hand, absolutely doing his own thing in a rigorous pursuit of abstraction, and at the same time very much engaging with this tradition of landscape painting and taking it apart and imagining a relationship with landscape, land, nature, and the sensation of, in this case, the selva, that is much more about perception, sensation, being immersed in it. It's just a completely different, it's not about mapping it out, visualizing it, fixing it, ordering it. It's much more about almost a kind of emotive, and that's how I see it at least. Which is not to say that this wasn't an artist that wasn't very cerebral and wasn't thinking very carefully about how they were making their paintings and also how they were choosing to title them. And there's obviously a kind of contradiction at play in a lot of his work between the abstraction of the canvas and the choice to give titles that locate the scene quite specifically in time and place. And often that's often in relation to Guyana and the spaces that Aubrey Williams had encountered during his youth, and then that he went back to periodically as his career moved on. I hope I've given you a sense of the complexity of what's going on here, or what I think is going on as far as I can see it from my viewpoint with the experience that I have. And I think that should help to realize just how limited the language that existed in London at the time for imagining and interpreting these paintings was, because this work, in spite of the fact that the early shows that Aubrey Williams had were really successful, the reviews that came out in the British press they were jubilant, but at the same time they framed the work in very primitivizing terms. So many have since remarked that it's very evident that the world of English or European art critics and journalists only had a very limited vocabulary for dealing with an artist who came from across the Atlantic, and particularly an artist of color. So they immediately went to a whole range of pre-established terms that had to do with something being exotic, being highly sensual, I don't want to repeat these terms because they've done enough violence historically, but I think you understand what I mean. And this led someone like Jan Carew to feel like they had the responsibility of stating in one of the few really articulate reviews of these exhibitions that Williams and I quote here, is not a wild boy from the Amazon. He's an intelligent painter evolving in a world full of traps and pitfalls. So there was always a need to state, these are not spontaneous expressions of someone who's just come out of the rainforest. So they've come out of the bush with no understanding of a very metropolitan conceptual context for the production of abstract art. And the very fact that this point had to be made tells us a lot about where the art world and art criticism was at that time. So the way I imagine it is that, for me, what this tells me is that at the time of Williams's foundational first shows in London, there was almost too much emphasis on identity. There was almost an obsession with talking about his own biography, his own persona, his own looks in relation to the paintings, even though the paintings were not portraits, were not figurative, and were not narrative. And at the same time, there was just not enough understanding of identity because the paintings were never really located in a seriously studied social context. So they were never located in the context of, for example, colonial relations. They were never located in the context of diaspora and what it may have meant to move from Georgetown to London. It was this sort of general subject that the reviewers surmised. And so unfortunately, this is the sort of background. If anything, perhaps one last point in relation to the last images, certainly they were not understood to have a connection with the petroglyphs. We were talking about this just a minute ago, about the function of the petroglyphs as instructions, codes passed on across generation of first people with instruction as to how, for example, to hunt or to make use of the available nature in a sustainable manner. And so this comes very early on with Aubrey Williams' interest in this symbolism and forms and meaning of the petroglyphs. There was already sort of ecological vocabulary embedded, almost like a code, within his abstract paintings, which would have been very difficult to see for many of the sort of elite art-going audiences that were encountering his paintings at the time. So the paintings from the outset worked on these different registers, almost as though there could have been a kind of London public that would have understood in a certain way, perhaps a Guyanese or even Amerindian public that would have read a different language, a different story, and a different ethic behind these abstract forms. Certainly, none of this came out in the press that surrounded the exhibitions. Perhaps partly because of the pressures of having to perform, survive, excel within the London art world, Aubrey Williams forged some incredibly strong connections with intellectuals, artists, literates of his generation, particularly coming through what came to be recognized then as the Caribbean diaspora. And so you see him, as many other artists like him at the time, working for and with their peers across different media. So these links within London were so crucial for the survival of these artists in the context of this environment that was sometimes incredibly generous and in other situations rather hostile. At the same time, it wasn't just some kind of survival network. These were artists and intellectuals who were engaged, as Aubrey Williams' daughter remembers, in an incredibly energetic and active conversation about things such as independence, the role of art, aesthetic, and literature in forging a path towards emancipation, the relationship between music, word, and image, the future possibility of a Caribbean sensibility across media. So these were really high-minded, incredibly articulate thinkers, as well as, in Aubrey Williams's case, visual artists. Which, to me, really kind of flies in the face of the provincialism of much of the British art world of those years. From this period, this is perhaps one of the most discussed paintings from this phase because of its title, to some extent. This is one of the paintings where we can see that by 1959, Aubrey Williams has already developed a very articulate consciousness around the politics of decolonization and what he would soon later refer to as post-colonialism. So the paintings become increasingly infused with a very stark critique of the history of colonialism. And in this particular canvas, the reference is almost an abstract one in itself. The title is definitely Conquistador, which can be seen as nodding back to the earliest phase of colonization of the Americas, but it also stands as a kind of prototype, a primer for all the subsequent ones, which especially in Guyana have proceeded in so many violent ways. The painting itself, again, the recurring theme of the petroglyph that merges almost into bone forms, and certainly there is a way of imagining this painting in relation to references to blood and soil, and again, questions of belonging, land rights, displacement, and the violence of the invasion, even though the painting exists very much on an abstract level rather than being a more one-dimensional sort of propaganda, political statements that's very easy to decipher. I think the strength of it is precisely that these forms, these shapes are somewhat unresolved and they kind of linger, and there are multiple ways of seeing them, which in a sense, perhaps this is too much of a leap, but also seems to do justice to the complicated relationship, human relationships and historical relationships that colonialism has itself spun over time.